If there is anything that we can learn from statistics, it is that humans love the visible, the tangible, the personal, the embedded, and the narrated. And we hate the abstract. This is the first and last lesson taught by Nasim Taleb in his book, Fooled by Randomness. However, he realized that this is an abstract concept in itself, and we as humans don't seem to be able to derive anything from general abstract comments. We need small and personal comments in order to work up to this. So, let me tell you a summary of a story of finance, of Wall Street, and of pure hard luck. Nasim Taleb asks the following question. If you could flip a coin once per year, and if you got heads, you would earn $10,000, and if you got tails, you would lose $10,000 and lose your job, would you take it? He analyzed the data of coin flips for people who would take this in this imaginary game. And he found that in the first year, you would have, let's say, 100 people. 50 of them, of course, would get $10,000. And then they had to have had $10,000 at the start, so let's say they had $20,000. So next year, they bet that amount. Half of that fail. So now it's down to 25. And then next year, 12 or 13. And then the next year, just donating all this money, eventually you would have a bunch of winners and losers. And that could be how stocks work, at least with day trading. With long term, it's more reliable than that, but in day trading, that could be how it works. And so Nasim Taleb went to various day trading organizations and compared his chart to the performance of various people who were working there. And he found there was no distinguishable skill. His example and the way that the firm actually worked were one and the same. Looking at the data produced by the day trading organization to justify their existence, he found that a lot of the people on the top were bold, adventurous, risk takers, willing to bet it all, and willing to work the extra hours in order to get that little advantage and try and get to every trend. And the unfortunate thing is they didn't ever look at the losers or the worst performers, who all had the same traits and a very similar strategy if they'd gotten far enough to get in. And this shows the first lesson of luck. People will make up stories if you are performing well, whether it's luck or not. A better example, I think, comes from Bill Gates. With his foundation, he was trying to set up better education for America. And he looked at all the statistics, and he saw that one of the most striking and consistent determining factors for kids who were doing well was small schools. And so he did a lot of effort in order to make smaller schools. He split apart large schools in order to make them into smaller organizations. Small schools seem to be the way to go. However, he didn't pay attention to what are the worst performing schools, which are small schools. It turns out when you take the average of a large group of students to see how well they do, those with a smaller size have a chance of doing much better and much lower. If you have to roll 3 dice and all of them have to get 6s, that's much easier than having to roll 300 dice and having them get all 6s. After they accounted for that number, it turns out that large schools actually tend to do a little bit better because they give people more opportunities. At least that's the narrative that I heard, but now I'm going to distrust reasoning and narrative. The second lesson that he teaches is that it seems that nature is trying to keep us fools. We more often than not go with our gut decision instead of rationalizing a decision, and we tend to justify that decision with a narrative. It's possible that confidence is just as good of a story as we can come up with for the situation. If we have enough data to form a good story, we do so, and that's our confidence. It appears we need these emotional parts of our brain. There are people who have, through car accident or other injury, gotten the emotional parts of their brain damaged so that they don't really process emotions as well and live in entirely logical mode. And what ends up happening is these people cannot make a decision, or it's very, very difficult for them to. Even getting out of bed in the morning takes pretty advanced calculations. And I think most of us are not happy with that. Most of us would be quite happy to just choose a random shirt and throw it on, as long as it's roughly acceptable to whatever it is we're doing that day. And we really only start to think about things that are difficult. The emotional part of our brain and our personality help us make 95% of decisions throughout the day and keep our routine up by deciding what we like and what we dislike. That's a very simple process to make very intellectual decisions. That's what our brain does. And it speeds up our decision making so much. But realizing that our brain has this mistake leads us to a couple interesting ideas. First, we underestimate luck compared to skill. What is skill, if you think about it? I think a good way to think about skill is a quote from Master and Commander. The character Captain Jack says, "I'm a captain. I can harness the wind in my sail, but I'm not the wind's damn creator." With that quote in mind, skill is the harnessing of situations and luck to do the most you can with them. But the opportunity needs to arise. This means that you need to be good enough in order to see the opportunity and seize the opportunity. So there's a minimum requirement in order to get the opportunity at all. But if you're prepared and you're ready to take it, you need to take advantage of every source of luck that you can. And that's what it actually means to do well. From looking at the numbers, it looks like people who are good at their job have a lot of talent and a lot of luck. And it looks like people who are great at their job have slightly more talent and a whole lot more luck. That's because they can seize on opportunities really fast. Some of those opportunities feed back into the skill, so it's not even in good comparison. It's possible that some of those people had equal
According to the author, just going after what's
reasonable
is not reasonable. Too many stockbrokers plan for the most reasonable gains and take some steps to stop the most reasonable losses without thinking about things like a pandemic or some other crash on the side. They know it's coming eventually, but they're not planned for it. They also aren't ready to capitalize on an opportunity at the greatest area. Something that Nasim Taleb does is he makes a account which is situational. So that way it can take advantage of the very rare opportunities that they see are very likely or inevitable to happen in the future, and they get a huge boost from that. But they generally suffer a little bit of money each day. Whereas any busts they can actually benefit from, or they don't suffer as much from. In this way, they're actually losing a little bit over time, but every so often there's a huge jump because there are some activities that are going to eventually happen that are rare. Because every day there's 1,000,000 trades. So if something goes wrong and it has like a 0.5 chance of occurring, not a lot of people are betting on that. But it's going to happen eventually, and it'll happen sooner rather than later. This is an interesting strategy and an interesting way of looking at life, where every rare event that is going to eventually happen is the moment that kind of propels your life forward. And if you can prepare for those sorts of opportunities, that's how you manage to make luck and randomness work for you. In addition to that, our thoughts of skill are probably wrong. I already said harnessing the wind is a good example of a skill, but now let's go into different examples, such as art. People tend to think of the progression of skill as a linear thing, like you learn this part of the skill, you learn this part of the skill, you learn this part of the skill. When we've looked at it, it doesn't seem to work that way. It seems that skills are mostly a collection of different ideas. Like if you're good at math, you actually have to be good at quite a few kinds of maths. And if you separate it down to individual math, that's still a couple steps you still need to be good at, like geometry, multiplication. If you do addition, you need to know what a number is, and you need to know what a multiplication symbol is, you need to know the format. There's all kinds of different things you need to do in order to be good at a skill. And you only really see development in the skill when you have all these different kinds of skills that are all working together. That means anywhere along the way, before you combine them all together, and before you can actually use them, mostly intuitively, you could have problems. And you also just need to be able to use them intuitively. Maybe you have learned every lesson, but they haven't connected in your head yet. or you just can't do it without feeling stressed or feeling like you need to go into a part of your mind where you're overthinking everything. What this has shown is that generally employees and skills cannot be measured like a quick graph going up, but instead with a huge bump every time that they get better. Plateauing, I suppose, is a good way of putting it, where it's like, oh, I've learned oh my god, suddenly much better. And then constant progression up like that. This means that people who spend a lot of time doing one skill or putting a lot of effort into something generally get rewards all at once. But that also means that it's much harder to predict skill development than people think. It's possible that there's some reasonable or narrative-related approach to explain all of this, but Nasim Taleb seems to show that most of the time when people are using reasoning, they're actually just justifying something in hindsight. They're explaining the why afterwards to provide a logical reason for doing something when none really was there beforehand. It just kind of made sense afterwards. This means that it's hard to trust people's opinions about something after the fact or their reasonable opinion about doing something before. For example, a lot of people think history or things that happened before were obvious to happen, or we're always going for the lowest hanging fruit. And that's a hard mentality to justify if you look at the numbers surrounding the situation. But even with all those numbers, people seem to think it's obvious, the decisions that were made. Being reasonable most of the time, according to Nasim Taleb, seems to be hindsight bias, making things that were in the past seem more reasonable and logical than they actually were, or justifying the actions you did take, as opposed to seeing the variety of different possibilities. And now we get to one of his most important lessons: probability, and not the mathematical kind. Most of the time, when people think of probability, they think of the odds, they think of percentage chance of happening. When the practical way to use that, according to Nasim Taleb, is to, when you get to a hard decision, you think about every creative possibility you can that seems reasonable, and even some that don't, just to explore different ideas. You try and forecast what is reasonable beyond that point. What are decisions that, and situations and consequences that could come from these various decisions? You come up with a integrated way to use all of them, or use as many as possible, or just choose one that is the best, and after analyzing this decision, that's a good use of foresight and a good use of probability. You know that there's something that can go wrong in this path, and because you've thought about all those other paths, you can potentially, if something goes wrong, realize that there's a new path that you're on now. Because something has gone wrong, you now know that this way is more efficient, so you can adapt like that. That, to him, is the way to use probability, which to me seems like foresight and planning. A good definition of foresight. He says to not take this too seriously, or any scientific method too seriously either. Because this is just one way of looking at the world, and we have to acknowledge that we're all ignorant to a lot of stuff. But, back to science being not taken too seriously. What is science? Science is a way of justifying beliefs or truths. And science has gotten around epistemology, which is the study of how to prove things are true, in philosophy in a very interesting way. Because epistemology is under scrutiny itself. It's possible we actually can't prove anything is true. So far, I think every theory that has come up to give a way of proving that something is undeniably true has so far been proven false in epistemology. There are some methods better than others, but we pretty much can't prove anything is true. We just kind of got to go off of a high chance. Science has taken this, and let's use the example of a heavyweight boxer. Let's say, you'll never prove that someone can perfectly box. And then a boxer says, then let me go up until I'm undefeated. That's how I'll prove it. If someone ever defeats me, that will mean that they have a better idea of what I'm doing than I do. And that's how theory works in science. You get this heavyweight boxer of a theory that's ready to take on all comers, and if they're ever taken down, even through a technicality, they need to be replaced. But this means that even in our justification of the truth, we could have a theory that's either
completely provable but not focusing on the right thing, or we're focusing on a part of science that has not been scrutinized fully yet, or is not the correct way to interpret our position, because science only works in specific circumstances. A rule that works in outer space in a black hole might not work, say, in a gravitational field somewhere else, or on like Earth. That idea that the knowledge and beliefs that we have and go throughout the day could not be applicable to our circumstances is one more reason that we have to assume we are acting emotionally, we're acting on routine, and we are probably acting not according to the best probability and out of ignorance. And that's okay. The author says to take a stoic mentality, acknowledge that that's what it is, acknowledge what you're feeling, even if what you're feeling and how your mind is working goes against what you want it to be. Say, this is what's happening, this is what I'm going to do about it, here's all the possibilities available to me, let me try and choose the best one, and go on. Randomness doesn't have to be a terrible thing, though. Acts that are random give us novelty, give us variety, give us some interests, and can also be the best moments of our life. The trick is in accepting harmless or productive acts of randomness and mitigating all of the bad ones and making sure that they don't affect us as much. That is the secret. Perhaps nature has intentionally made us fools in order to work through the chaos and keep a positive spirit as we progress forever forward in our world. But that's no reason not to keep working as hard as we can to achieve the results that we can. Even if now we know that luck is probably a huge part of it. More so than it seems. Hopefully, this will convince you to take a more statistical mind to things. The book doesn't get into many statistics at all, but hopefully it will convince you to start thinking about your world in that way. Now that you've heard all the little lessons that lead up to the big lesson, I'm going to repeat that abstract bit of the ending again. We, as humans, favor the visible, the tangible, the embedded, the personal, and the narrated. And we scorn the abstract. But if you want to become one of the scorned, if you want to learn how to use statistics and numbers to help guide your life, then I recommend Fooled by Randomness. And I will see you all later today. I'm sorry I'm late. That there's really no excuse for it. I am so sorry. Bye, everyone. We bought our stocks for good fun. Hey, now we're on a good run. We bought our stocks and got lucky. We bought our stocks and got lucky.